Is your kitchen old and outdated? Do you have dark or golden oak doors? Is your space in need of a makeover, but you just don't know where to start? Well, you came to the right place. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make clean, modern-looking shaker-style doors with nothing more than a pile of wood and a table saw. By the end, you'll be ready to make cabinet doors just like these. This video is part 1 of 3 on making cabinet doors. Part 2 will discuss how to install hinges and hardware and mount the doors to your cabinets. And part 3 will be all about painting these doors, with a lot of detail on how to use a paint sprayer to get the perfect finish. This project starts just like any other, sifting through a pile of wood to determine which piece I want to start with. After I made my selection, I carefully disregard everything I know about lifting things properly and struggle to get this over to my miter saw station. Eventually, I do get it over there, causing minimal harm to my lower back, and also minimal harm to my pride. Now at this point, you're probably thinking that I lied to you because I said you would only need a table saw for this job. Well, if you don't have a miter saw or a chop saw, you can make these crosscuts right on the table saw. I have a miter saw, so I chose to use that to cut everything down to its proper length. After cutting all my pieces down, I run everything through the jointer to get one flat face, then through the planer to get an even thickness, then back over to the jointer to get a nice square edge on one side. This will be used to reference off my table saw fence in order to get a nice clean rip so it's an even width. Now if you don't have a planer or a jointer, you can buy your wood already surfaced. It would be S4S or surfaced 4 sides. I would advise against buying this wood at Home Depot or Lowe's because even if they advertise as surfaced wood, it's not always square and you're going to have trouble. If you can find a local hardwood dealer, they will already have wood that's been surfaced on all 4 sides, or they'll do it for you for a small fee. This wood is going to be a lot better quality, and it'll be a lot straighter, and your project's going to turn out a lot nicer. Once I rip everything down to its final width, I go back over to my saw and cut off the ends where the planer may have caused a little bit of snipe on the ends. If you bought S4S lumber, you're not going to have to do this step. Next, I head over to the table saw and insert my dado stack. This allows me to cut a groove the entire length of the wood that's eventually going to hold the MDF panel in the center of our door. If you don't have a dado stack, or your saw can't accept one, you can do it with a single saw blade. You'll just have to make multiple passes. The finished thickness of my doors is 3/4 of an inch, so I insert a 1/4 inch dado stack to cut a 1/4 inch groove, which will hold a 1/4 inch MDF panel. I then use a setup block to measure the height of the groove, which will also be a 1/4 of an inch. Once I have the height set, I then move the setup block between the blade and the fence to make sure there's a 1/4 inch on either side of the groove. That'll give a nice, even appearance for the reveal of these doors. With my saw set up, I run a test piece through and make a test groove. I then go ahead and measure, making sure I have just over a 1/4 of an inch on either side and about a 1/4 of an inch in the center. Eventually, when I sand all these down, the 2 outside portions will be just about a 1/4 of an inch, and the final thickness will be 3/4. With everything dialed in the way I want it, I proceed to run all my pieces through, making a groove on the inside. Once I have the groove cut in all my pieces, it's time to set up to cut some tongues. The vertical pieces, known as the stiles, will only have a groove, and the horizontal pieces, known as rails, will have a tongue that fits inside of the groove and helps hold the frame together. Here I am, using the miter gauge that came with my saw to make these cuts against the sacrificial fence. Here I'm using a piece of plywood for a sacrificial fence, which allows me to get the dado stack right up to the fence to cut off the excess. Once I test fit my door together, it's time to cut some panels. Back over the table saw, I just adjust my fence to exactly the width I need. Once everything's set, I'm going to take a piece of MDF and just run it through to the exact size. Since I've already test fitted all of my door frames and I know the exact measurements, I'm going to cut all my panels in one step. That way, it saves setup time on the saw. With all my pieces cut, it's now time to fully assemble all the doors to make sure everything fits nice and snug before we go and secure everything permanently with glue. Here I am off to the side of the screen, assembling one of the doors. With all my doors dry fit together, I'm going to take them apart and then go ahead and sand all the panels before I finally assemble them. It's a lot easier to sand them like this than once they're inside the frame, all glued together. MDF comes pretty smooth as it is, so there's no need to start with a low grit like 80 or 100. Usually when I sand the MDF panels, I start right with 120, 150, 180, and then finally 220. You want to sand all the way to 220 for paint grade pieces because it's going to give you a better, smoother layer underneath and your finish is going to come out a lot better. I also take this opportunity to sand the inside of all the door frames because it's also going to be difficult to do it once they're put together. With everything sanded, it's time for glue up. Before I put glue on anything, I'm going to do one more dry fit just to make sure everything's going to fit together nice and I won't have any trouble once I start putting glue on pieces. Once I'm happy with how everything goes together, I'm going to put a small bead of glue inside the groove on one of the stiles. You want to make sure that you don't put it too close to the panel because when you clamp everything up, you don't want any glue squeeze out getting onto the panel. It's just going to make an unnecessary mess and it'll be a pain to clean up. You really only need a small amount of glue to hold these doors together, and they're going to be very, very strong. I also put a thin layer of glue on the tongue on each of the rails. With everything glued up, it's time to put these in clamps. I'm going to use these parallel clamps, but you can use F-style clamps or whatever you have. I'm going to start with 4. This is going to ensure that everything gets pulled in nice and square. Once I check for square and I'm happy with how the doors look, I'll remove 2 of the clamps and just leave 2 clamps on for drying. These will have to sit in clamps for at least an hour to dry, but I usually try and leave them for a couple of hours. If you're like me and you only have a limited amount of clamps, you're going to have to do your glue up in batches if you're making a lot of doors. I chose to do mine 4 at a time. tightening down your clamps, you want everything nice and snug so nothing moves on you. But you don't want to over tighten them because then you run the risk of breaking your door or having it bow and not being square. Once everything's clamped up, I check the corners for square and everything looks good. Not following my own advice, I got a little glue too close to the panel and had some squeeze out. Then I go and clean up all the other squeeze out in all of the joints. It's easier to wipe it down now with a wet rag than try and scrape dried glue off the door, so I try and get as much as I can right now. And I'll have to take care of the rest once it's out of clamps. As promised, once I'm happy with the way the door looks, I remove 2 of the clamps, leaving only 2 clamps on the door while it's drying. Once this batch of doors is dry, I'll go ahead and repeat the process, gluing up all my other doors, which will take several more sets of glue ups. Once all the doors are out of clamps and dry, it's time to sand. For sanding the faces, I'm going to start with 80 grit. I'll sand every door down to 80 grit, move to 120, 150, 180, and 220. Sanding is one of the most important parts of the job because it's going to dictate how your overall finish looks when you get time to paint. It's very important not to skip a step. You want to make sure you work your way all the way up the grits, starting with 80 and finishing with 220. You can go higher than 220 if you want, but it's not necessary and it's going to waste a lot of time. I'm also going to touch up the panels during this sanding step. But keep in mind that I already sanded the entire edge of the panel that's going inside the door. Here they are, a whole pile of kitchen cabinet doors ready for paint. Stay tuned for the next video when I show you how to install the hardware, the hinges, and test fit these into the cabinets.